start. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the ACL Year-Round Mentorship. Today's section will be about effective communication in NLP research. And a little bit more background on the organization side. The ACL Year-Round Mentorship is inspired from various mentoring sessions during NLP events, like during NLP conferences. And it's led by, this mentorship is led by Radha Mehachia, Mohit Bansal, Vinod Prabhakaran, Zijing Jing, myself, Ashkan Kazemi, Tejas Vedya. And for today, we're very glad to have three very wonderful panelists. They are Professor Dirk Hovy, and Professor Minyan Khan, and also Sebastian Ruder from Google AI. Yeah, and we will start the section by 15 minutes sort of warm up introduction of each one of us, and maybe some brief thoughts, like 1 or 2 bullet point of thoughts on effective communication. And then we will go to the Slido to select from the most upvoted question and then answer all the way to the end of this hour. And just to broaden our view for effective communication, I think communication might be a very big term. It could include how people write papers, include how people present themselves, or even how to write blogs or Twitter posts and so on. So it's also a topic that many junior researchers are interested in. Now let's start with the round of intro and some brief thoughts. I guess we can do the alphabetical order of the first name. And we start with Dirk.
All right, let's do that. Both first and last name, well, depending on how you sort it. An associate professor at Bocconi University in Milan, in Italy. I work on a variety of things, and I've been writing papers for a long time. Before I did NLP, I studied language and literature. That was in a different lifetime. And some of the things I learned there actually did port over. My quick thoughts on communications, and then I'm going to pass on the torch. When I graduated, so last year of my PhD, I attended a seminar which is called Beyond the PhD, and there was a branding expert. Some American company, so the thing is, if you work on something and 2 people in your field talk about your subject and your name doesn't come out.
Dick, we cannot hear you very well. Like the connection is like sort of breaking from time to time. Dick, can you hear me right now? So I cannot hear you in a very continuous way. Like it's still like break from time to time. Maybe try connecting through other devices. Okay, then we can give a bit more time to Dick and start with Minyan first. Great.
Okay, so like Dirk was saying, I think I caught part of it, is that Dirk goes first because both in first name and last name, we're alphabetically ordered in the right way. So I'm an associate professor over in the National University of Singapore, UTC 8, so it's about evening hours here. I've been doing NLP for quite a while. When I was undergraduate, I was not really thinking about what to do. I went to Columbia University in New York and tried my hand at doing internships in business and found that to be extremely boring, although quite money-making. And I decided the poor man's house is better for me. So I decided to become an academic and haven't regretted it. But the path led to Singapore, and I've been here since then. So a little bit about research communication, I used to lead the ACL anthology, although Matt Post is now a current director, and he's doing an absolutely stellar and spectacular job of that. And as part of that post, I got to think much more about research communication and how our research field goes in general. So I really very interested in about slow research, how to do things properly and give it enough time and thought. And the important thing I think about research communications in general is that when you think about research, it is trying to impact other people, right? So you want to make sure what you're doing finds the right audience. So that's the key part. Like if you know where other people in your field or in your subfield are looking for information, that's where you want to be. So that has to deal with, the outlets that you talk to, the ways that you communicate. And it is very much a life cycle. Like when you think about academic publications, you have to write them, you have to write the code. Sometimes you publish the code base, and there's a lot of maintenance jobs after you publish an article. Like you may have to edit some of your figures and numbers, as well as answer questions about your code. All of those are part of the research communication aspect. So I'll talk about that more later, but I'll hand the torch over to Sebastian.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Mien, and thanks, Dirk. So I'm Sebastian. I'm a research scientist at Google Research, based in Berlin since recently, and I'm mostly working on kind of multilingual, cross-lingual NLP and NLP for low resource languages. And maybe before we get into further discussion, so I think a couple of high-level thoughts from my side. I think research communication, like a lot of things we're doing, is a skill, something that is kind of acquired and that you can learn and get better at. So I think one of my most important takeaways is that I find really useful to try to practice like how to communicate effectively as much as possible, particularly during the PhD. And because the way we usually write papers, it's typically there's one paper after every like 2 months or 3 months, or like after a longer period. So I think it's very useful to try to write, to try to communicate also in the interim, maybe in kind of lower stakes settings. So I found it personally very helpful to try writing things just for a wider audience, whether that is like on blogs or other kinds of articles to different platforms that are available now. And so just trying to practice things that are kind of within this realm of research communication. The other thing I just want to mention, and one aspect that I really enjoy and like and appreciate about research communication, is that I think in its essence, it's kind of the ambition is to be as simple as possible. So I think in terms of communicating in research in our community versus other things like Mien mentioned for comparison to business, for instance, is that you really want to have things that can stand on its own in terms of the results and the model and the presentation that you have. So something that you can really try to condense and boil down to its atomic parts. And I think for me also the kind of flip side of that is that I think it's very good not to try to make things overly complicated. So often in many machine learning papers in particular, people try to hide behind equations or a lot of convoluted explanations. So really trying to make sure that your if you make your paper or your presentation as accessible as possible, that it is still convincing to its audience, and that it flows kind of naturally if you boil it down to kind of its main components. And I think the last thing I just want to quickly mention, and I think something I maybe got from Dirk as well, is that I think it's really useful in order to have impact to not only show like talk about your own work, but show how it relates to and can be useful for other people. So highlighting the connections and the relationships to either other people's work or other areas or other fields as well, I think is quite important.
Great.
Yeah, apologies for that. I found out the network here is crap. I hope it works better now. I tethered through my phone. So, but if there's still issues, then let me know, please.
Great. I think at least the previous sentence was perfectly clear. And then we start from the questions on Slido. The first question is, do you have experience in communicating your research to non-specialists? If so, how do you explain the most complex ideas to them? I would expect maybe two types of specialists that immediately come to my mind. One is interdisciplinary collaborators who are not from CS departments. The other is maybe our family, friends, or like external companies who didn't specialize in AI technology. Yeah, I guess like we could start from whoever. Maybe Dirk,
I can break the ice. Yeah. Okay, that's a great question, I think, because I feel like a lot of times when we talk about communication, the focus is so much on paper writing, and I wholeheartedly agree, by the way, with everything the other two have said before. And that, I think one thing I would like to add is that we should know the audience and we should know the medium that we're communicating in. And I think oftentimes that gets confused, right? So people make a presentation as if it's a paper or a poster, or they make a poster like it's a blog post or so. And all of these things have different impact and different audiences. And I think when talking to non-specialists, actually doesn't necessarily matter whether they're scientists or non-scientists. I think one of the things that we first have to check is the reliance on shorthands and concepts. So you cannot say, oh, you just, you initialize your model differently. You're like, whoa, what is a model? Like, what is initialize? And, like things like RNN, LSTM, transformer are out the window completely, right? So what I tend to do is to use sort of metaphors or comparisons or sort of very general examples. It oftentimes also helps me to take a concrete example and say, okay, let's say you have a lot of text and you want to find out which political parties hold what position on a certain issue. And then you can start explaining things. You can say, well, for us, it's fairly obvious because we can do this and that. And this is how we would map it onto computers. And I think you should never assume your audience is stupid, right? Like no matter who you talk to. But I haven't yet met an audience that said like, no, this is too easy, make it more complicated, right? If you explain something in a very straightforward, simple, direct way, then the people who already know what you're talking about have like 5 minutes where they can feel very smart, and then they feel great because they're like, oh, I knew this already. And everybody else is like, oh, this is not as intimidating and scary as I thought. I understand what this is, and I feel like I can contribute to the discussion. So I think, questioning all of the preconceived notions and all of the shorthands and keeping things very straightforward. And I think it's very useful there, but actually once we get to scientific communication down, ask like, what is the interesting thing about this? Can I explain this in 30 seconds to somebody? Yeah.
Great.
Maybe I can just add a couple of thoughts. That I think in general, actually what Dirk said, I wholeheartedly agree. I think maybe just some additional points. On the one hand, kind of the topic or what you choose to explain or communicate to an audience, I think is also something that is worth consideration. So, for instance, a topic that you don't have a very good grasp on, you will find it's going to be harder to explain or communicate to others. So one, I think, very useful side effect in terms of like practicing or communicating to like non-scientific or broader audiences is that it really forces you to try to develop a deeper understanding so that you don't rely on these shorthands that Dirk mentioned, and really that you try to get at things on a deeper level. So I think just in terms of developing your scientific reasoning and understanding skills, I think it's a very, very useful exercise. And I think also topic-wise, it can be very useful regarding what Dick mentioned in terms of knowing your target audience. If you have, for instance, if there's something that you've learned over like the last half a year or year, so mainly if you can remember how it felt or what it was like kind of not knowing about this area. Because often if you can just put yourself in the shoes of your target audience and kind of know, okay, in what ways would it be, what ways did you learn about this topic yourself, or what way would be good if you had learned it that way, that can also be very helpful in terms of informing your communication. And lastly, I only can second in terms of the use and the usefulness of using kind of visualizations or comparisons of metaphors kind of from this like broader realm. For instance, one of the first like more like broadly accessible blog posts I wrote on gradient descent optimization algorithms. I think one of the reasons that was also quite successful was because in trying to understand this myself, I also tried to rely on some visualizations or some ways to intuit or develop some intuition through okay, picturing this as some it's like a ball rolling down the hill, or developing some intuitions around how these algorithms work. And I think those kind of intuitions can be very useful if you've developed them for yourself for kind of a broader audience too.
I'll just add a tiny bit here. I think especially to those who haven't started, like Sebastian said, it's good to practice. One thing that undergraduates and beginning researchers sometimes do is they try to tutor each other. So we do hire a lot of undergraduate tutors and TAs within NUS, and that helps a lot. You know, they may not explain things perfectly, but that's the whole point. Like you've heard, I'm sure, many times that the more you teach it, the better you understand. And that's definitely true. So you can start right away, you know, you know, related to blogs and other things of that sort, you know, the earlier you start and the more regular you do it, which is what Sebastian was emphasizing earlier, the better it gets, right? So you shouldn't wait until you really need to communicate. Right? Because especially with blogs and other things like Twitter or other social media, the longer your presence and the more continued your involvement, the higher impact you have. So it's an investment. It's a long-term investment as well.
Great. I really like the answers. And also inspired by this question, which asks about communication to non-specialists. And also, as every communication needs to settle down the audience and the medium, maybe we could structure today's section as different case where we need effective communication. We could then dive into the case of junior researchers. Let's say people are undergrad, master students, early PhD, or gap year students, this type of background, and we're writing our first paper. I guess for people who attended the mentorship sessions, maybe most of the people need to look for resources and do their first paper largely on their own. So what are some public resources people could look into, or some paper styles they should imitate? So sort of general recommendations for first paper writers.
I can start, and I have like a pitch. It's a book by Kate Turabian. It has a very long title, A Manual for authors of thesis, research papers, and and Kate Turabian was also involved in like the Chicago Manual of Style, and so like how to form tables and images, but it does walk you through how to structure a paragraph, how to structure a sentence, and really gives you like the step-by-step example. This book earlier, you can get it on Amazon. I don't think it's very expensive, and I found that like the best resource ever, and that really, you know, crystallized some things. I have a couple of slides. Oh yeah, perfect, thanks. I have a couple of slides that I can share afterwards. So what we do in my lab is like a little writing workshop every now and then. based on some of those recommendations, you really only need to like follow some very simple rules and like very simple steps, and that can improve your writing a lot, I find. The other thing that Minion already mentioned is like get your friends and colleagues involved, do a little writing circle. We do paper clinics before we submit papers, where we, everybody brings 3 printouts of their papers, and then you put them in the middle. Everybody takes 3 other papers and writes comments. You learn a lot by giving comments, but you also get a lot of comments back then on your writing. And yeah, I think those would be my starting tips.
Okay, so I'll go. So there's some links that both Sebastian and I put on the Slack. Sorry, the Zoom chat. I guess they'll get propagated over at some point to the channel on Slack. What I find helpful to recommend is for students when they read, to also read as a meta critique, right? So you're not reading for the content. You also want to read for why they structured the paper the way they did, right? And I think also very important, I ask the students this all the time, like, why didn't they add this particular detail in their paper, which you need for replication? Or why did they discuss this topic instead of something else? Because there's always a trade-off, right? And it's very important to realize you have an opportunity cost when you write. You could write something, but it's at the cost of something else. You could put a figure in, but it's at the cost of something else. So when you think of it this way, you're really having an optimization problem, right? And you want to make sure that your story and your central premise stays true. And that's a very important part, because you typically, when a reviewer or a professor is reading your article, they're not paying 100% attention. It's really difficult to do that. I mean, I challenge many of you to read a paper wholeheartedly without interruption. I think that era is sometimes long gone. But the whole point is, like, despite those challenges, you still have to be able to make something clear to your readership. Something that I hear a lot from students is that, I wrote that part in the paper. How come the reviewer didn't see that? And, actually, I tell my students, this is your fault, because it wasn't telegraphed clearly enough. It could be buried in the footnote or in the middle of a paragraph. And because you didn't try to reinforce it or put it as a topic sentence, it becomes easy to miss. So I think that's a very important tip. One other thing that I'll say is that I find it good to write the introduction and conclusion very drafty at the beginning, to sort of center yourself on the page, but then go back and then throw it away after you've written most of it, and then try to rewrite it, because the framing of the paper really dictates how a reviewer or reader is going to position that paper in their mental space when they read it.
Cool. Yeah, I just added, I think Jason here. Jason Eisner had a couple of nice advice posts, not just related to paper writing, but kind of different aspects to the PhD. One I particularly enjoyed, I think that's called "Write the Paper First," where he basically kind of recommends before you do anything. So if you have a research direction in mind, writing kind of how the abstract or how the part of the intro of your ideal paper would look like, and kind of using that to structure your research. So basically looking at, okay, what story do you want to tell in the end from in your paper, and what kind of experiments, what hypothesis do you need to test to make sure that that story is true, or that you can present that convincingly. So how can you make how can you conduct your research so that it is in line with the story and the narrative you want to tell in the paper? And I think that kind of that aspect, having kind of a clear thread through your paper and a clear story and narrative that you're telling, I think is really really important, and probably a hallmark of the best papers, that they can really have something that directly hooks the reader and makes it easy to follow along. Yeah, and I think similarly to what was already mentioned, I think if you're reading papers, just kind of keeping note of the things you like, or the aspects that you really found kind of useful or convincing. Also, what kind of like argumentative structures that you found really lent credence to their work, and yeah, kind of seeing if they work for your own work. But yeah, over time you're gonna kind of develop a bit of a feeling and a preference for certain things over others. And in general, I feel like in our community, there's kind of a standard structure a bit for certain types of papers, like for your modeling paper or for your dataset paper. There's kind of certain, at least to some extent, expected structures that people generally adhere to. I think where it gets a bit harder typically is if you have things that try to break out of that structure. If you do things that are not just a model paper, not just a data paper, where I think it's a bit more tricky to really make sure that you actually get the point across that you're trying to make. Yeah, so I just want to leave it at that.
Maybe can I quickly add something on top of things that the two have said before? I oftentimes tell my students to write the abstract first when they just have the idea of what they want to do. Keep it to an abstract, and like what you want to do should cross. And you will change that abstract later and do an idea of where you want it to go with this. It's a historical record, but also it will make it clear for you when you face all of these decisions. Should I do this or that? Should I explore this option or that option? You can go back to your abstract and it will tell you, was this something that makes sense for the story you're trying to tell? And I think, working on that abstract is super important. So Sebastian said there are all these sections that are expected. I always call them the trained monkey section, because like a trained monkey could write the data description and the model description. They're very cookie cutter, like standard. But I think where your creativity and the meat goes is the abstract and the introduction. And I always tell my lab, you win or you lose the reviewer on the first page, and probably they have a sense of whether they like your paper after the abstract. So if you ever read an abstract and you're like, wow, that is so cool, I want to know what they did, you will read this paper with a totally different mindset. You'll be much more alert and attentive, but you'll also forgive some things that maybe otherwise you would have criticized. But you just approach it in a different way than if you get to page 2 and you're still like, what is it they're trying to do? I'm still not sure why I'm reading this paper and what's going to come. And I think having a clear abstract first and the idea first and following that idea, I think makes a huge difference there.
Yeah, I really like the comment. I remember also maybe within Jason Eisner's blog saying like 1,000 people see the title and then 100 see the abstract and then the introduction, then finally the concrete details. And yeah, so when wrapping up on the writing first paper suggestion, something that I also observe is that there are some small tips that usually junior students cannot grasp very early, such as like tables should not encourage vertical lines, or when you write a formula, you should take care of the comma or the period after the formula. And also natural language processing, the N, L, and P should not be capitalized. Like for all these minor things that sometimes really bother reviewers or affect the professionalism, but sometimes like I feel like that's the exact thing that junior researchers, if without a good lab atmosphere, without very hands-on help, maybe they could miss on that. Would there be some ways to democratize that type of small tips to students?
So I'll take a first cut at it. I actually think these small tips are useful, but I don't think a seasoned reviewer would necessarily marginalize the paper due to these infractions. It's very, I've seen it happen, especially with my own reviewing team when they're junior. They will pick on nitpicks, and we have to dial that back a tone. because it's really important to get the idea across. So that framing and the key aspects are important. So, I mean, for example, you can go into an interview for a tech interview in jeans and pants, or, you know, dress and tie. It shouldn't matter too much, but it does have some presentation abilities, right? So I think what Sebastian and Dirk said earlier is that, you know, especially for papers, really, there is a prescribed recipe, you know, convention, and those things are your friends. They're really there so that the reviewer already has a good structure to hang your contributions off of, right? When you break that convention structure, you're struggling to make the reviewer do two things at once, right? Which is, one, understand your idea, and two, pay attention to the structure of what you're trying to say. So sometimes, you know, you may say, well, I have both a model and a data set, or you know, I've done some annotation and I'm doing some analysis on top of it. Sometimes it's helpful to just try to take one template and put that in. But coming back to these conventions, I think each lab has its certain conventions. There are nitpicks about individual faculty, but I'm hoping that most of our reviewers will forgive that when it's not exactly their cup of tea or their cup of style. Yeah.
Great, thanks for the short comments. Yeah, it was just a minor question following up. Then when we go back to the main body of the paper, there's a related question about when people say first write the abstract, then what about in the middle of the research when a student is almost done with the experiment? Then what is the best time to wrap up, write down, crystallize the ongoing experiments for paper in the whole research process? Let me see if I understand the question correctly. I guess maybe just how do we
jump
parallelize
from experimenting to
writing?
So I tell my master's students, the last month you don't run any experiments anymore. Like if you're still running experiments in the last month, you don't have time to write the thesis. And like thesis is a longer thing, right? But I always see this with you know, especially new young researchers, that you know there's a deadline and they're running experiments up until the deadline, and it's like in the grand scheme of things it's probably not going to change. Like if you have a clear story a week before, there's a false, like if things are still muddled the evening before, it's not going to get better if you do an all-nighter running experiments. So I always do this paper clinic like a week before the deadline. It's our internal deadline, and then the draft needs to stand. Yeah, you will change some things, and maybe, you know, you have like, oh, there'll be some more numbers here, or we'll add a graph or something like that. But the idea and the main body, the central table needs to be there. So I don't know, that if you want a number, I would say like stop running experiments a week before and focus on getting the message across. But in real life, obviously, you know, things change.
Yeah, just I think, yeah, I would generally agree with that. I think you should try to get to this. So from your abstract or your main hypothesis, you should try to get to this like the main table, or the key results table that provides like evidence for your hypothesis. Sometime like a couple of weeks, ideally, before you intend to submit or publish the paper, to give you enough time then as you're writing up and trying to like incorporate the different aspects of those results, to give you enough time to do analysis or kind of probe further if there are any interesting phenomena or any observations that don't really align maybe completely with the general narrative. Because often I feel I find in papers, I think the most interesting details is if the authors actually bother to do that a little bit of extra work to do some analysis or look a bit more closely at some particular settings and run additional experiments for those. And I think in order to do that with enough time, you need to have the main results finished and have also kind of written most of the paper already.
Yeah, I'll just plug what Sebastian said earlier, which is that you should be doing writing all the time. There's really not much excuse for it. One thing that I do find helpful is to concentrate on what I call figure one. And what that is that the original figure at the beginning of the paper that you see, which is an example of what in a modeling paper is supposed to be accomplished, right? So many of the papers that you'll see have this type of storyline where, in the first example, they give some text that needs to be either generated or some classification task. And the figure one is supposed to be, wouldn't it be great if we could do this, right? And then what you do throughout the paper is introduce a model that does exactly that, right? So it's actually sort of like a flashback type of setting where just like in a movie, you have a flashback that's actually in the middle of the movie, and you paint it forward by showing how that model or how that data set comes to be throughout your paper. And then by the end of the paper, it's really clear that that figure one is actually created by your model. Okay, it's done that way. So if you think about what goes into a great figure one, that can be a very good source of that. So many of the students in my group know what that means. Like I say, what's your figure one? And then they'll think about what does that initial figure on the first or second page look like? How is it demonstrating what the core or key part of the paper is, and how does that reflect what the abstract looks like? So it's a combination of the abstract and a little bit of visualization, like Sebastian was saying earlier.
Yeah, I totally agree. Go ahead.
Sorry, I also think this goes back to reduce their cognitive load as much as you can. Spoilers are okay. Like, this is not a crime novel, right? It's like, be very upfront. I personally love figure one on the first page. There's some papers that do it, and I think it's great because you just look at it and you're like, oh, okay. It's also very easy to spot the paper again if you're searching for it, because you're like, oh, it's the one with the whatever on the first page. And like, so be very unambiguous in your what you're going to communicate in the paper. I think like some of the greatest talks or movies, take like very simple steps, and your reader is always with you. They're always like, yes, I follow you. Okay, cool. So what now? You're like, okay, now that we said that, how about this thing, right? And you're like, yes, absolutely, I'm following, right? And so you sort of go step by step along, and like you never really have to make like one major jump to go, oh wait, what just happened, right? And I think pre-signaling, like, here's where this paper is going to go, and this is what you're going to see, and by the way, here's a figure that tells you, wouldn't it be nice if, and by the end of the paper you'll know how to get there. I think that's sort of the dream.
Very inspiring.
I just wanted to mention a quick thing just regarding something that was mentioned like a bit earlier, where I think Winnie or Dirk recommended to talk to your peers and try to establish like a kind of a cycle of giving each other feedback on paper drafts. And yeah, just in case if you don't have access to like a supervisor who can give you that detailed writing feedback, or like peers, and if you're part of a small lab only, what I think is also great these days in the NLP and ML community is that there are a lot of kind of platforms, resources online. For instance, The Gradient is kind of an online newspaper for machine learning, where you can submit articles to write, and they have a great editorial team that really gives you kind of very useful editing feedback in terms of how to make your paper and your writing kind of more concise and precise, that I've also learned a lot from. So if you're kind of missing this really actionable editing feedback, reaching out or just submitting an article to one of these online newspapers can also be a really very valuable experience.
Great, very nice suggestions. Awesome. Then I'll take note on all of them. Then we go through two more cases. One case is for a student who has already published a paper, then what about the things that are after paper publication, including attending the poster section, giving or social media things to PR the paper? I guess we could perhaps imagine a student with their first or second paper who are like maybe 2 years into research or 3 years into research, that type of career stage. Or since the video will also be published on YouTube, it could also be a middle career researcher, like 10 years into research, but thinking about broadening their impact. Then what might be some good ways to PR the papers?
So I did run some small experiments, but they're backed up by real science. And if you put things on Twitter, for example, or LinkedIn, actually seems to be very, widely received, depending on which audience you target. Those papers tend to get cited more. And like the easier you make it, for people to find and cite that paper and to understand what it's about, the higher
Dirk, I think the previous several sentences are missed. So I think we
and like good tweet.
Yeah, I think we miss using your sentence about the easier you make it for people to find and cite it.
Oh yeah, the easier you make it, the more this will get cited. And there's definitely people I've come across because of their social media presence. So crafting a good tweet, I think, is worth something, and especially if you're breaking into like a news cycle, I think it's a good way to sort of get the message out there. So you can't just write a paper and hope that people will find it. You'll have to make it easy for people to spot it, and the more you can broadcast and explain it, the better.
Great. I guess for crafting a good tweet, some big companies have very interesting things, but that's backed up by their UI team. Like just for concrete things, maybe if you think about good tweets, you can post in the chat about like example tweets or formats that people can broadcast their research in.
So I think the key part is, you need to find the right audience. So tweets are good for a general audience, and they work for people who are already rich in some cases, like they have followers or they're from well-known institutions. So when you have an NLP researcher or a junior student in not such a well-known institution, it can be hard. You can do all of these things, but they won't work very well. So I think it's also good to start from the ground, meaning that take a look at who you're citing, what researchers would care about what you're writing. And then many times you can write to them directly and say, hey, I noticed you're doing this type of research. I've written a paper and I think it's cites your work, or there's something interesting that I want to tell you about, right? Because you've concentrated on your figure one and you know what type of message you're trying to say, then it might be easier to build a following. So it's that type of grassroots work that helps first. Once you've built up a community, then it's easier to do broadcast. And it also depends on, again, the audience, because Western media follows Twitter a lot. We do that in Singapore too. But if you look at China, action is on WeChat and Baidu Zidao and all these other resources that are out there. So you really have to know where your audience is. If your audience happens to be mostly researchers in China, then you may want to consider, if you know Mandarin Chinese, to use that media, or find somebody in your lab or a mentor who can help you broadcast in that area. So that's another part. I think, research communication goes in both directions. So it's also when you want to ask questions, right? So sometimes you want to talk to other people about how they did their experiment, replicate their work, etc. And it's a good idea to establish that filter early, right? Because let's say you write a paper on later on and you're trying to reach your senior researcher, your email may fall in spam. But if you've asked them earlier, oh, I liked your model, I couldn't replicate it, can you send me details? Maybe they have already started a dialogue with you or your team, right? And sometimes it's not reaching the professor, but reaching the other students who are actually doing the groundwork, right? Building that network with your peers, right? And that can help you establish more of a network later.
Another thing that you can do beyond writing a tweet is to write kind of a longer form blog post about a paper. And I think that isn't applicable for every paper. In some papers, you might have already said everything there is to say, or some papers might stand alone. But I think it works particularly well if in the blog post you don't just say, okay, hey, you don't just copy paste from the paper or write what is already contained in the paper anyway, but if you can add some additional value to the paper, for instance, if you can highlight why this paper on some NLP task is how it connects to other NLP tasks, or what types of things didn't work. You can, if that didn't fit in the paper, you can write that in a blog post, or maybe talk about further implications or future directions. So all the kind of things that you weren't able to fit in the paper, but which still would be interesting, those could, for instance, make it into such a blog post. And similar to what was already said, I think over time, in order to build kind of an audience or to get more exposure for your papers, I think it's really like one important aspect is to kind of build a brand for yourself. So knowing something that other people can associate you and your research with, and having that kind of in one, like an easily accessible spot, like a website, so that when people might find a new paper or like a related topic and they want to know about this area, they know, okay, where they can find additional papers from you or about that topic. And along those lines, it can also really help if you write not just papers, but maybe just broader articles that kind of connect or span additional things related to that area of interest.
I'll just elaborate a little bit more, if you don't mind, on one part, which is that, one other way that you can reach out is to, highlight somebody else's work that you appreciate. So in our institution, I ask my PhD students, especially junior ones, go find a researcher who you admire, and let's invite them to give a talk in our lab. They don't have to be a professor. It's actually okay if we invite junior students, like undergraduates or PhD students who've written their first paper, because they're much less likely to turn you down, right? And this is a good way to turn the tables, right? Because you don't have a chance to connect with them in other ways, right? You can actually say, we're going to go over your paper in our reading group session in our lab or in our institution. Do you mind making a guest cameo? Just 5 minutes, we want to ask you some questions. Or if you don't mind and you already have your paper on YouTube, we are going to watch that already, but maybe you can come in for a question and answer session, because now with Zoom, it's pretty easy. You don't have to travel. So that's one other way that you can do it. So my group did this past year. We did every semester. I asked all of the junior PhD students, find one rock star PhD student, not faculty, who you admire, who's in their second, third, fourth year, and let's invite them to give a talk, because they usually appreciate it anyways, because they don't have enough chances to talk, especially if you're from areas of the world where it's harder to travel or things like that.
Yeah, we've actually done the same thing in my lab. Every Friday afternoon, we have we call it the coding aperitivo. Aperitivo is like a Milanese thing where it's like a happy hour, but yeah, we have like coding or presentations. And during the pandemic, we started that, and the only rule was person must not be you know, professor or more must be somebody who is doing some cool stuff that you like, and when
Interesting. We are still missing your voices, but feel free to type in the chat if that's better. Great. Then we will wrap up with the final case scenario. As we mentioned about the paper writing, talking to non-technical people, and the last case would be like contributing to the like entire community, mainly aiming at like starters, like beginners in NLP. Sometimes people write blogs, contribute open source resources, and the audience might be students that are taking their first NLP course and want to explore more, or people who don't have enough resources, so they mainly have to self-learn. Then that's the main purpose. And also some other, one related question could also be if an undergrad potentially wanting to apply for PhD, if they have extra time, should they devote the time to writing good blogs? Does that help their PhD applications as well? Yep.
So I'm faculty at NUS, and while not on the admissions committee, I can tell you that our admissions committee is too busy to check individual cases for blogs. So it may not help directly. It will help after you get sort of in the door. So from a graduate school perspective, there's basically two thresholds, right? There's the threshold for consideration, meaning that you have a good GRE or you have a good, equivalent of that. And your credentials look good from a quantitative perspective, right? Your CAP and test scores are generally good enough. Okay, once you pass that threshold, then all of the other things get invoked. Okay, so certainly I think everyone knows that if you have good recommendation letters, that helps a lot. Right. So if you've had a mentor who can vouch for you, that really, really helps a lot because, research being what it is, academia is very social oriented. So it really helps to have a social endorsement. That said, if you don't have those, then the next best thing would be, of course, a blog or something where you can say, you have enough of a follower or you've presented things in a good way. And then if the reviewer has enough time to check those, that can be very useful. There's also the flip side where some graduate schools will have their professors directly admit you into their department with some sanity checks usually. And that means you're applying for a particular PI's lab rather than the school in general. So NUS does a little bit of both. For example, we have a general pool of students that come in screened by an admission pool, usually our assistant professors who are hungry to get students. But there's also the case where certain people with grants can directly fund PhD students. And that's much more typical, let's say, in the US and EU. So those cases, if you're applying for a particular lab, then you have to make sure that professor cares about the topic of your blog posts, right? Because if it's that case, then I'm sure they'll read your blog post and see whether it's technically accurate or you have some interesting insights.
Yeah. And just to add to that, so I think even from the perspective of like recommendation letter writers or just for recruiting junior candidates into research roles, I think blogs can also just be a good testament of your scientific and research communication ability. Because even if you have if you've already managed to write a paper, maybe with an undergrad supervisor. So often, like from that paper, it's not directly apparent how much was your input or your voice versus your undergrad supervisor. And I think a blog can kind of be more accurate or a more faithful assessment of how you communicate research. So it's something I've definitely, like if an applicant had that, I've definitely looked at in the past and already like really appreciate it as a kind of additional evidence for how well they can communicate properly. Because in the end, I think beyond the like ability to implement and basic software engineering ability, I think there's like clear communication ability, I think is really important on a research trajectory.
Great. Thank you so much for the wonderful suggestions. I also found today's mentoring session in general very interesting because for people who do NLP, we're already interested in communication. So it's like better communication for some communication technologies. And yeah, it's just very enjoyable when writing or communicating with others. And with this, we might conclude our session today. And heartily thank you for both both of the panelists here, and also thank you for Dirk. And see you all next month.